Welcome to GLOBEWATCH with me, Charles Ebuni. Chaotic, that seems to be the best word provided by some economists to describe the economic situation of the Central African sub-region made up of 6 countries and using one monetary unit, the CFA franc. The situation seems to be extremely difficult as oil prices across and around the world are falling, and the reason is simple. At least 5 of the 6 countries depend on oil for their economic survival, and measures are being taken currently as resolutions of the 21-point agenda provided at the last Yaoundé Extraordinary CEMAC Summit are being implemented by governments of the region. What will be the best strategy to walk out of the current economic quagmire and financial morosity? My guest today is the resident representative of the International Monetary Fund. KALONJI, welcome to GLOBEWATCH.
Thank you for having me.
Most economists say the Central Africa economic situation is in a chaotic economic growth and reserve level. What does that mean?
Well, what we can say is that the current economic situation for the CEMAC sub-region is very difficult, as it is for most oil-producing countries in the world and in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. So CEMAC, as you know, is made of 5 out of 6 countries who are oil exporters, and therefore the current low prices, and as you know, there was a significant reduction at the end of 2014 in oil prices, in global oil prices, which has affected very negatively the economies of the region. At the same time, the region has also been touched by a tense security situation, which has contributed to the shock experienced by these economies.
You spoke of this shock. In 2015, the IMF said that the growth rate of the sub-region moved from 4.5% to about 2.2%. How dire is the situation today after the December 23 Yaoundé Extraordinary Summit?
So we estimate that growth for the region has been in 2016 close to 0, if not a little bit under 0%. On account of primarily lower oil prices, lower oil production, and at the same time, lower public investment. So those have contributed to the poor economic performance in 2016. And for 2017, we expect that growth will increase slightly, reaching about 1.3% for the region, on account of a modest recovery in oil prices, which we have observed. Now, beyond that, starting in 2018 and all the way to the medium term, gradually growth will go back to about 3%, which is still significantly lower than what we've observed over the past decade of very high oil prices.
This is an economic zone made up of about 50 million inhabitants, roughly. When you say the growth rate currently it's at 0 or 0%, what does that mean to an ordinary citizen of the sub-region in terms of his or her pockets?
Well, it certainly means that the economic activity has slowed down, so the creation of wealth is also slowing down. Inflation is increasing a little bit, but to a large extent, inflation has been more or less...
Is it more than 3% now, which is the economically accepted scientific level for normal job creation, because there is a degree of inflation necessary in any economy.
So as you know, the conversion level for the CMAC zone is 3%. Right now, inflation is below 3%. So inflation is still under control, which allows...
Is that any good news?
It is to a certain extent, insofar as it means that the purchasing power of households has not been eroded too much. But at the same time, as I said, the reduction in economic activity is hurting them in terms of job creation, in terms of growth in activity and those kind of things. So it is a difficult situation for households.
You said that next year the growth is expected to recover and is estimated at about 1.8%, getting to 2%. What kind of measures are needed by governments of the sub-region at this time to balance the books?
So what we've seen is some adjustment by national authorities in the CMAC region, but that adjustment has been insufficient to mitigate the impact, the severe impact of the crisis. So what needs to be done is further efforts to consolidate the fiscal positions, because what is happening with the region is that because of the shocks and the lower growth and lower revenues because of oil prices, governments have been borrowing to continue their spending. So that has created a very rapid and important increase in public debt, which is worrisome. So what you will want to see is efforts to slow down the buildup of debt. And the way you do it is by trying to mobilize more non-oil revenues and at the same time rationalize your spending. So you want to protect social spending, but at the same time you will need to reduce some of the spending, for instance, on investment.
Last December 23, there was an extraordinary summit of CEMAC member countries in Yaoundé, and they had a 21-point resolution, and one of them was about budgetary restructuring of the economies. What kind of budgetary elements should be taken into consideration at this time in particular?
Mm-hmm. So right now, really what you need is because you are in a fixed exchange rate regime, you will have to fall back on fiscal policies. And the fiscal policies that needs to be, the adjustment that needs to be done in fiscal policy is two-pronged. One, as I mentioned before, you need to increase the mobilization of non-oil revenues. And you do that by widening the tax base so that you capture more people that pay taxes, and therefore you can get more revenues to spend on very important social priority spending and as well as infrastructure spending. So that's the first part, revenues. The second part is you want to reduce your spending to match the fact that you lost a big part of your revenues due to oil prices going down. And you need to basically do priorities. You can't spend on everything you will have wanted to spend. You need to make priorities and focus on those type of spending that are growth generating and also that protects the poor.
Cameroon, for example, because of security challenges, which has consumed at least 20% of the country's GDP alongside Chad, what kind of budgetary restrictions or budgetary elements are supposed to be taken into consideration in this economic restructuring program? Salary cuts?
Well, you know that Cameroon is actually the most diversified economy in the sub-region, in the CMAC region, and therefore it's the one that has been least affected by the oil price shock because it doesn't depend on oil as much as the others. Yet it's still facing the shock, as you mentioned, including the increase in security spending, which is crowding out other spending. right? So what you will want is you want to continue the very good efforts that have been made to increase non-oil revenues on one side. On the second side, on the other side rather, you want to reduce spending. Now, as I mentioned before, the way you do it is you want to protect social spending. You also do not necessarily to cut salaries. You do not have to cut salary necessarily.
When you talk about protection of social spending, what does that mean? Salary?
Education, health. Those are the ones that affect the poor the most. And you have room to cut some of the infrastructure or investment spending with focusing on priorities that will bring you the economic growth that you want.
There has been much talk of involvement in bilateral and multilateral economic engagements or policies to revamp the dying economies, especially those in Gabon, especially those in Equatorial Guinea, especially those in Chad. And one key partner in this entire economic morosity is the IMF. What will be the best policy option from the IMF now? A complete return to structural adjustment program?
Well, the IMF continues to work with all the countries of the regions. As you know, we have programs in the Central African Republic and in Chad. We provide financing for those countries that have programs with us, and the countries like Cameroon and the other semi-countries which do not have programs with us, we continue having a dialogue as part of our annual consultations where we provide macroeconomic advice. We provide
at this particular moment focusing on provision of more loans or advisory comments that you need to go back to the structural adjustment programs, which were, of course, very painful to the country's economies if you take the period from 1980 to roughly 1995.
Well, what we are talking about...
A return to strategic growth and employment strategic purpose?
What we're talking about is pretty much a very open dialogue and discussions with authorities in Cameroon and in other semi-countries on finding the best solutions in order to exit the crisis. And as I mentioned, those include higher revenue mobilization, non-oil revenues, and rationalizing spending. Now, as I mentioned before, you will want to protect certain priority spending and therefore focus on some spending such as investment spending that can be less important at this moment and that can be pushed to a later date. So you focus on those that are more that's a priority to bring you the growth that you need to exit the crisis. At the same time, you need to make efforts in order to improve the business climate so that you can bring in the private sector that will then take over as the main engine for growth and job creation and improvement of the poverty situation.
You just spoke about providing an enabling environment to attract investors. And the latest report from Transparency International puts SABAC member countries as some of the best corrupt nations in the world, and that it's an element of bad governance. And just after the Yaoundé meeting, the Chadian president Idriss Déby said that companies that have invested in the sub-region will probably not have their 100% profits out of the sub-region, stating that, quote, they should be reinvested here and ensure the creation of wealth. What can actually attract investors in an environment where good governance is very far, in an environment where corruption is near, where judicial insecurity is very rampant? How do they put themselves out of this bad economic water?
And what you are touching on is a very important subject. And in fact, you're aware that there is, for instance, here in Cameroon, what's called the Cameroon Business Forum, which is a very good opportunities for public sector to sit down with private sector and to hear from each other what are the impediments for more investment in the country. And these forums provide an opportunity and a roadmap for the public sector to make reforms that will enable the environment to be more appealing to investors. And that's a very key element. Without an appealing business climate, you will have very little investment, and therefore your private sector will be impeded.
The International Monetary Fund or the Bretton Woods institutions in particular, including the World Bank, are very much present in this area. They have been providing a lot of assistance. You are just coming out of a meeting with bankers of the Central African sub-region. In 2015, it is reported that the Central Bank of the sub-region, BEAC, had a profit of roughly 244 million euros. That should be at least 160.7 billion CFA francs. What explains the fact that today we are talking of a morose economic situation when the central bank of these countries is reporting unexplainable profits?
Well, I'm sure that you will get a better explanation from the central bank itself, but as any central banks, they have assets that they have invested, and some of these assets can be sold, and if they're sold at a profit, that will reflect in the book as this type of results.
Is the sub-region running out of reserves?
Well, reserves are definitely falling at a very fast pace.
What is the percentage or the rate today?
And basically, as opposed to looking at percentage, what you can look at is a general measure, which is the coverage of imports from reserves, and those are now below three months of imports. So in a region with a fixed rate regime, you will want to have more coverage, import coverage. So the decrease in reserves is an issue.
Last weeks and months or so, there has been talk of too much turmoil in the currency level, especially the fact that it is pegged with the ex-French franc, which is no longer existing, and today is pegged with the European Union, probably central bank, the euro. And I put this question to your boss, who is in Washington, Christine Lagarde. Why is everybody afraid to do devaluation?
Well, one of the things that you have to look at when you're talking about the exchange rate is what is the considered the equilibrium level of exchange rate. That means the level that is consistent with the macroeconomic situation. And our last analysis showed that for the region, the exchange rate was broadly in line with fundamentals. And that means that at the time when we did this analysis, we did not see a need, an indication that the exchange rate was overvalued. So you cannot take measures without having the analysis behind it that backs it up. What is more important at this stage is to put together a package of measures that will make sure to ensure the stability, macroeconomic stability. That means stability of prices, stability of exchange rate, stability of fiscal position, and of financial policies. Those are all the things that you have to look at and not focus solely on the exchange rate.
A while ago, you spoke about diversification of the economies of the sub-region. But let me just use some euphemisms which are used in some financial corridors of power. When you go to the IMF in particular, to the World Bank in particular, and this is not an insult, but when you talk to those who are at the World Bank, internal sources, when you call of Gabon, they say, oh, you are talking about that petrol station, because basically after petrol, there is virtually no other resource in Gabon in which the economy can hang on. And this can go on to be extended to Equatorial Guinea or Chad. When you take petrol, you add cotton. The story ends there. What are the other constituent elements that these economies can invest to reverse the economic situation?
I think you mentioned a key element, which is the need for diversification away from oil. And in order to do that, you need to, again, get back to this business climate that has to be conducive to private sector investor coming in and investing.
What areas can they really invest in these countries where the other constituent elements are really lacking? Tourism, agriculture, forestry, what are the key areas that can jumpstart the whole machine?
I think that you have, as you mentioned, you have mentioned several sectors. Today there is
Chad is mostly a desert.
There is no need to necessarily pick champions. What you can and what you should do is to allow the private sector to come in and see where the needs are. Some countries develop tourism. Some countries develop services, being banking services, being IT services. There are a slew of opportunities if you let the private sector have access to financing. So you have inclusive financial sector, for instance. People can get a loan as an entrepreneur. You can borrow from a bank and finance your activity. You will come up with things that are needed in the market, and that's how you create value, right? So we do not want to pick a sector, but rather we think that if the environment, the economic environment is proper and access to financing is there, the private sector will do the rest.
The International Monetary Fund has been playing more of a role of an advisory board or council or institution or partner to governments of the sub-region. If you were to tag them on key areas to invest in what they call in economics thrifty spending and thrifty investment, that is prioritizing what is important and what do you think can produce needed results, what are the areas you advise them?
Well, I think that, as we mentioned, business climate is certainly one. We also feel that the region and sub-Saharan Africa in general still has an important gap in infrastructure that needs to be filled. And therefore, these particular efforts to improve the infrastructure in countries is very welcome. However, it has to be done in a way that is inducive to producing results. So it has to be more efficient. And it's very important that countries invest in the efficiency of public investment so that money is not wasted, but indeed it is invested in those type of infrastructure that will tomorrow bring more business, bring more investment, and grow those countries which are all expecting or aspiring to reaching emerging market status.
Emerging market status indeed. When you look at the debt situation of the countries involved, do you think that any reasonable investor can still borrow their money?
Well, public debt is one thing, right? Private debt is another. In this region, definitely public debt is growing, but households are not borrowing as much as the public sector. It's not what you see in other areas in the world where you have an important private sector debt overhang. So here what you have is public sector, and the public sector is taking the scarce resources from which borrowing resources which no longer are available to a private sector.
Through treasury bonds.
That's the main way that that the funds are borrowed, but they also direct borrowing from banks or from partners, and at the same time there is also Eurobond issuance in some countries. So what you need is to do a fiscal consolidation that will allow your public debt needs to be under control, and that will allow the private sector to have more resources to borrow. And at the same time, you have to have a financial sector that is able to indeed lend to the private sector, because it's not necessarily
yet cash.
It is not necessarily true that today the private sector is or the banks are willing to lend to the private sector because of asymmetric information. For instance, they do not know, they do not have enough information on the borrower to feel comfortable lending to that. So you have
collateral securities and other issues need to come into on board.
Yes, you have to find, you know, and we do give advice on that. How do you make it so that it becomes easier for the private sector to have access to financing?
How do you qualify the economic situation in the Central African sub-region today? Just a word.
Difficult, challenging, but still an opportunity to get out of there stronger.
Kalonji, thank you very much indeed for being guest on GlobeWatch.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.